Hey guys, it's Ohmwrecker, and I'm taking a look at Assassin's Creed 3 today. This is going to be more of a review, because this is a game that cannot be shown in just 30 minutes of raw gameplay. There's just so much to it. So, first off, this is the first major full-on sequel to an Assassin's Creed game since 2009. Assassin's Creed 3 features an all-new engine called Anvil Next. It's got a new main character called Connor, and it's also in an entirely new setting. It's leaving behind the 15th century, and it moves on to the foundation of America. Now, much like previous Assassin's Creed games, Desmond Miles is in the modern times and is using an Animus device to explore history. And they're doing this because they're trying to find information that would potentially help them save the world. Now, this isn't a spoiler. This has been known since pretty much the beginning of the franchise. And with Desmond, he's got a really interesting bloodline of pretty much former assassins. There was Altair in the first game, and then there was Ezio, who was featured in Assassin's Creed 2, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, and also Revelations, which was the last game in the franchise. And now Desmond is living through the eyes of Connor. Connor is a Native American, and during this time, the expansion of the colonists began to affect his tribe. There was also conflict between the colonists and the British. And anyone who's ever taken an American history class or any sort of history probably knows that this was a very chaotic time. So the developers have recreated Boston and New York in excruciating detail. And these cities really feel alive. The only downside to this is that the developers couldn't use some of the old structures that made Assassin's Creed games so awesome. You don't have those humongous churches and wonders or towers to climb. Now players are limited to more of a horizontal landscape. They're not climbing so much as they are leaping from building to building or running through structures, or even hopping from tree branch to tree branch. But to try to make up for that, the developers have created the Frontier, which is extremely open. It's very much like Red Dead Redemption in that there's a ton of space for players to explore, roam about, seek out little collectibles or hunt animals. There's a lot to do. There's also missions scattered about in the Frontier, but that's one of the ways that the developers have tried to add to the franchise when they've had to also make adjustments. Ubisoft has also added sea battles to the game, which are epic. And even if the player doesn't want to engage in them, there are some scattered about the main campaign. But I would highly recommend playing through them, especially when you've got off time. There are actual sea battles for players to seek out, and they can range from just flat out destroying ships to boarding them or even taking out their masts with chain shot. You've also got some sea missions that are based off navigation. Now, naval stuff aside, let's go back to the characters. Both the characters' histories and their relationships are very well fleshed out in this game, much as they were in the previous Assassin's Creed titles. And Ubisoft made sure to give players a very good look at what brought Connor to the Brotherhood. So we saw that a little bit with Ezio as you got to play through him when he was a teenager and see how he rose. You also get to see that with Connor. And they accomplish this by letting you jump into his shoes literally as far back as when he was a little boy playing hide-and-go-seek with his friends in the forest. That's when you jump in. And as he ages, it becomes clear why he gets involved with the Brotherhood, why he seeks them out. Now, the only downside about Connor is that, honestly, he's not quite as likable or charismatic as Ezio was. And at times he comes off a little bit like a young Anakin Skywalker. And I don't say that with the intent of spoiling anything. It's not that he's becoming the next Darth Vader, because he's not. I'm not going to, go ahead and say anything like that. But he has this attitude to him. It seems like he's got a chip on his shoulder, and he's a little bit jaded. And it's definitely different compared to Altair and Ezio, but then again, different can be good. Now, Desmond, on the other hand, he's still himself. He's still the Desmond that players have gotten to know over the previous games, and he's still in the modern day. He's exploring the real world, but he's also been experiencing some of the bleeding effect, where in the first game he picked up Eagle Sense, and then in Assassin's Creed 2, he began to pick up some of the fighting skills from Ezio. And Assassin's Creed 3 is kind of his peak. Now, he is in the real world, and they've been finally able to locate a key location that they've been looking for. Again, I'm not going to spoil this, but there are still some things to do, and this brings Desmond to locations like Brazil or even modern-day New York. So there is still an exploration element with Desmond, on top of everything that you're doing with Connor. And Desmond's ultimate mission, as mentioned, is to try to potentially stop some sort of doomsday scenario. So that's about as far as I'm going to go into Desmond's story, but there is a fair amount of content there, and I was actually quite satisfied with it up until the end, which you guys can see for yourselves, but I think the ending itself could have been a little bit better. Now, when it comes to game content, there's a ton of it, but a lot of it comes off as fluff. And I know I've already mentioned the sea battles, but there's also a market system. You can build out your homestead, you can go and hunt animals in the wilderness, and there's even brotherhood missions again. But they feel like they've been wasted in this game. Hunting and trading goods doesn't really offer much. There's not a whole lot to spend your money on in the game, and most of the larger encounters when you're hunting, you know, this is mainly for resources that you'd put on the market, but these hunting instances are typically quick time events. Like if you run into a bear or a wolf or whatever else, it's usually a quick little quick time game that's really easy to beat, and it's very predictable, and it doesn't feel like it was fleshed out quite as well as it could have been. The Brotherhood missions also still exist, but they've been minimized in value. In Assassin's Creed 3, it's much less common to find assassins that you can actually recruit, and in the previous games that wasn't so much the case. I recall finding assassins quite often, especially when I was exploring the cities. Now, even when you do find assassins, there's a limited number of missions that you can send them out on, and there's not as much of a path for upgrades. You can't go and upgrade their armor or their weapons manually. So it seems like the whole system has been gimped. And beyond that, outside of recruiting and sending assassins out on missions, there's also the real estate factor that used to be a part of the previous games, where you could go and buy locations throughout the cities and even the landscape. You could buy bridges, and it was a really cool thing, I thought. It was something I enjoyed, and they've completely done away with that. You can upgrade your homestead, you can bring different people into the homestead that will help generate resources and stuff like that, but it's not quite the same. You no longer get that sense of owning the city, essentially, as you would get with the previous games. And the trading and market system is kind of useless, because I never once found myself in the game short on money. I mean, literally, by the time I was finished, I had 20-something thousand coins in the bank ready to use, and really didn't have a whole lot to use it on. Now, the collectibles have also changed in this game. In Assassin's Creed Revelations, for example, there was a collectible called the Memoir Pages, and if you collected all of them, it would unlock the Hagia Sophia, which would allow you to get a special suit of armor. And the Hagia Sophia, once you got inside, was this epic, wonder that there was a ton of stuff to climb. You'd get way up at the ceiling, and it was a really cool experience. In this game, there's nothing like that. You've got almanac pages for Benjamin Franklin, and for the most part, they're pretty close to useless, aside from unlocking what I would call the most awkward discussion you'll ever have with a character in a game, and that's courtesy of Benjamin Franklin. But aside from that, there's not a whole lot of a reason to collect his almanac pages. There are also feathers to collect, and the developers do a good job of putting them in hard-to-reach places, but they're really only good for reaching a 100% score. And then there's one last big collectible, but that's more at the end of the game, and all they're really good for are unlocking cheats. Eagle Vision is also hardly used in this game. You'll be prompted to use it on a few occasions, but aside from that, you're not going to be looking for any secret glyphs or anything like that. And there's also nothing even close to Da Vinci in this game. You're not going to be getting poison blades or anything like that from Da Vinci. Obviously, he's long and gone. He's been dead for quite some time, and there's really nobody in this game that replaces him that's going to be giving you cool upgrades to mess with, or even access to vehicles. For those of you that remember, there was a Da Vinci flying machine, there was even a Da Vinci tank. That type of stuff is gone, and I'm not entirely convinced yet that the ship combat has completely replaced it. And one last thing on the gameplay side before I get into the visuals and the audio is that Connor always feels equally lethal no matter what weapons he's using. The game does try to communicate a difference in the weapons where they're of different strengths, but they all seem equally powerful even though the game tries to communicate otherwise. This is primarily because of the combo and counter systems. The combo system will allow you to get off extra kills sometimes when you're chaining from one enemy to the next. but the counter system itself is what makes combat in this game super easy. And it's mainly because the developers have polished it up to a point when it's really easy to execute once you get the hang of it, and at that point you could start taking on large groups of enemies without any problem whatsoever. This kind of devalues the variety of weapons in the game, and this includes weapons like the bow or the gun or even the rope dart. When you master melee combat to that point, it's usually much more efficient to just run in and start slaying them in seconds versus trying to time stealth kills that really have no extra value. Aside from that, combat is polished and there are a lot of animations to support all of the kill moves, but it would have been nice to see more utility in some of the ranged weapons and even some of the old favorites like the poison blade. Now let's move on to the visuals. I've got to say that Assassin's Creed 3 looks awesome on the Xbox 360. Now, it doesn't have all of the bells and whistles that I'm going to be expecting on the PC version, which I plan on checking out soon, but it is definitely one of the best looking games on the 360 platform. There are some occasional texture pop-in issues though, and I've seen some oddities with the shadows, but aside from that, it looks great, and they still continue to accomplish this while drawing tons of characters on screen at the same time. And these aren't just, you know, little placeholder, low detail characters off in the distance. We're talking 50, 60 plus characters at once on screen, and they move about the world, they interact with it, they react to it, they see the things that you do, they'll make comments. So it's still awesome. I mean, the way that this game makes the world feel absolutely alive. The animations are extremely well done, even more so than previous games. The only downside to the animation and climbing system is that in this version of the game, both Connor and Desmond seem a little bit too willing to try to climb over everything, and this can really screw you up at some moments in the game, especially during chase scenes where you're trying to stay on path to catch an enemy. The cinematics also look great, and they seem to all be done in-engine, which goes to show you how good this thing looks. The audio experience is top-notch from the voice work to the music. I actually enjoyed the music so much that I plan on buying the official soundtrack when it comes out. But when you hear Connor's tribespeople speak, they speak in their native tongue, and when you're in the actual cities of New York and Boston, you'll hear a wide variety of accents, from French to English to Scottish, and it's really cool. It makes you feel like you just got dropped off into the 18th century when there wasn't such a thing as an American accent at the time. And now there's one last thing I want to touch on before I wrap up this review, and that's multiplayer. It deserves a special mention because I could almost recommend this game off that alone. Although there are some new additions that I'm not entirely sure about just yet, and I'll comment on those later, but for those of you who haven't played it, it's very, very unique, and that's something that I look for nowadays in my games, is something that's different. And with Brotherhood, that was the first Assassin's Creed game to introduce these types of game modes, and then Revelations improved them even further, and now here Assassin's Creed 3 improves it to a point where I think it's potentially the best yet. Now I should note I haven't had a chance to get all the way through the levels yet, and now there's also prestige modes. I haven't been able to explore that at all either, but they have very clearly polished this up to a point where it might just be at its peak. Now you've still got the core game modes. There's solo modes and there's team modes on the solo side. You've got Deathmatch, Wanted, and Assassinate. On the team side, you've got Domination, Manhunt, and Artifact Assault. There's an entirely new mode though that players can play, and this consists of having players go against AI this time. It's not player versus player, and it's called Wolfpack. So the way that this works is that players have to go against a number of phases. There's as many as 25. Highest I've gotten right now is 12, but each phase is more difficult than the last. So the targets that you're after start to be able to defend themselves. They can start dropping smoke bombs or whatever else. That's if they know that you're coming and you're about to kill them. So the game mode itself is really a race against the clock to kill your targets, which are all AI, as efficiently as possible, taking advantage of the fact that at lower levels they're weak and at higher levels they're much more aware. So you've got to keep that into mind, but it's a really good way to practice and get players up to speed before they jump into games with real players. Now, the only thing that concerns me a little bit is the fact that Ubisoft has created a cash shop. And yes, we're talking about a microtransaction model inside a full-price game. So you're buying this game for full price, and then there's microtransactions as well if you want to unlock stuff early or get cosmetics. Now the cosmetics you can look beyond, it's not that huge of a deal, and most of the stuff you can unlock anyway with just your standard points that you earn by playing the game. The problem though that I see with this cash shop is that you can also unlock abilities that you can't normally get till much later after you level up a bunch. So occasionally you'll see players that are low level that have access to high level abilities, and they got it because they paid for it. Meanwhile, you're low level and you can't use stuff like poison, darts, or whatever else because you didn't spend money. So I think some people that are against potentially pay-to-win scenarios are going to have an issue with this. Others might not care so much since you can unlock everything by yourself, but again, it is kind of a little bit weird given how hostile some players have been before when it comes to the concept that people can potentially pay money to win the game. So that's something to keep in mind, but thus far I haven't seen anything too imbalancing. I have seen some players that very clearly did spend money, but I was still able to take them out. And again, in multiplayer, you're still pretty damn powerful no matter what. Well guys, I think I've covered just about everything I wanted to, so let's get down to the score. I'm going to go ahead and go with a 9 out of 10 on this one. I realized that I did have some complaints, I did find some things a little bit fluffy, but the things that I found fluffy I could easily avoid. I didn't really have to engage in the market system, I didn't have to send my assassins out on missions or anything like that, and the stuff that I did enjoy was really well done. It's the core gameplay side of things, the story, the missions. The only complaints I had on the mission side was really just that some of the chase scenes, I would occasionally get stuck on things or I would try to climb things I didn't mean to, but aside from that, the game is very well done. The story itself is great. I think it was a good wrap up to the series. The ending could have been a tiny bit better, but I realized that the developers had a plan, and I don't want to go into that plan so much as for spoiler reasons, but it makes sense with what they're trying to do. Now, again, a 9 out of 10 for this thing, and I would almost recommend it just off even the multiplayer alone. But the story itself, I mean, this is a game that's going to give you lots of entertainment, and for those who do like to explore things, there's a ton to explore. There's lots of animals to hunt, there's the homestead that you can expand out, there's naval missions, so there's a lot there for you guys on both sides, and it's definitely a game that gives you a lot of value for your money. So that's it guys, thanks for watching. As always, please be sure to like, favorite, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends about my channel, I always appreciate when you guys do that, and stay tuned for more videos. I'll see you guys next time.